The inspector's attention rested on the delicate curve of the hook, bent slightly inward, as though tugged by a hurried hand. He straightened, dusting his trouser knee with a small, habitual motion that suggested long experience rising from floors not designed for comfort. "I suppose," Mrs. Halberd announced to the crowd at large, "someone might have wanted to damage it. Such things happen nowadays. Vandalism, malice." She spoke the last word with relish, as though it were a rare spice. "Or," Purbright suggested gently, "it may simply be an unfortunate accident." His tone implied neither belief nor disbelief, merely a preference for calm. Marion Fosdyke did not relax. Her hands clutched each other in a manner far too taut for someone lamenting only sentimental loss. Her gaze flickered again toward the tables where the chutney judging had recently concluded. She seemed to be checking for someone, or checking that someone was not looking at her. "You shouldn't blame yourself, Marion," offered Mr. Cribb, though it was unclear why he assumed she did. His eyes darted from Purbright to the smashed lantern, as if worried the inspector would accuse him by default. "No one is blaming anyone," Purbright said, "though perhaps we might make a space and allow the floor to be cleared." He nodded to Sergeant Malley, who had arrived just in time to appear useful. As Malley fetched a broom, Purbright watched the widow step back from the debris with surprising reluctance, as though the shards still held something that might betray her. She glanced sharply at Malley's sweeping, then at Purbright, her expression tightening for just a moment before smoothing into polite grief. One of the junior volunteers approached Purbright timidly. "Inspector, someone said they saw a man lingering behind this table earlier. A stranger?" "In Flaxborough," Purbright murmured. "Strangers tend to stand out." He turned to the girl. "Did you see him yourself?" "No," she admitted, "but Mrs. Penworthy said she did, and she's very reliable about unusual people." "Indeed. Thank you." The volunteer hurried away, eager to escape the gravity of an inspector's attention. Purbright's gaze lingered briefly on the crowd dispersing around the incident, some disappointed, some secretly pleased by the injection of drama. A few of the more competitive exhibitors looked almost guilty, as though fearing their own clattering jars might be next. "Inspector," Marion said suddenly, her voice low enough to imply she did not wish to be overheard. "I should like the remains returned to me when you've finished with them." "Certainly," Purbright replied, "though I doubt we shall need to keep them long." She pressed her lips together. "Good." Her reaction struck him as curiously intense, less sorrow for a broken keepsake than anxiety over what might be discovered among the fragments. He filed the observation away, without outward sign. "Mrs. Fosdyke," he said mildly, "did anyone else handle the lantern today?" "No," she answered too quickly, then added, "Not that I saw." "And yet it fell," Purbright said, with no hint of accusation. "Objects do rather depend on people, one way or another." She stared at him. For a moment something uncertain flickered in her eyes, then vanished. "Everyone was rushing about. These shows are chaos, Inspector." "So they are." He gave a small, courteous bow, as if agreeing with her about the general incompetence of the universe. "If you recall anything further, however trivial, do let me know." She nodded, though her glance shifted once more to the judging tables, and the faintest shiver passed through her shoulders. Malley straightened from his sweeping dustpan in hand. "All clear, sir?" "Thank you." Purbright surveyed the little circle of now bare floorboards. Nothing remained of the lantern but a faint smear where oil had seeped long ago. "Well, Mrs. Fosdyke, you may continue your display." But Marion did not resume her place behind the table. Instead, She folded her hands in front of her and announced, "I think I'll go home. It's been an upsetting morning." "Of course," Purbright said kindly. Several spectators made sympathetic noises, though their eyes gleamed with curiosity. Widow Fosdyke gathered her shawl, turned sharply, and walked away with a briskness that undermined her claim of distress. As she left the hall, Purbright watched her go, noting the way she paused at the door, scanning the street outside before stepping into it. Not merely shaken, wary. He tapped the bent little hook now lying in Mally's dustpan. "Odd thing," he murmured. "Hooks don't usually bend themselves." "Rust," Mally suggested, hopeful for a simple explanation. "Perhaps." Purbright slipped into his familiar thoughtful quiet. But rust doesn't pick its moments quite so carefully. And as the hall resumed its gentle bustle of poultry feathers, pickle jars, and indignant gossip, Inspector Purbright filed away the morning's strangeness with the certainty that the lantern had fallen, but not by chance. By the time Inspector Purbright returned to the station and hung his hat on its accustomed peg, the broken lantern had already travelled farther in rumour than Marion Fosdyke could have carried it in a wheelbarrow. News in Flaxborough did not depend on fact so much as on the stamina of those willing to repeat something before taking a breath. By noon, the poultry and preserves show had ended, but the true exhibition of conjecture, embroidery, and cheerful misinterpretation had only just begun. At the library, two elderly sisters, Miss Perivale and Miss Perivale, the younger by 11 months and never allowed to forget it, whispered fiercely behind the returns desk. The younger insisted she had seen a tall man in a mackintosh hovering near Marion's stall as though judging distances. The elder corrected her. The man had been measuring angles, which in her view was worse. Neither had mentioned these observations to Purbright, as both were convinced men in mackintoshes signified espionage and would therefore confuse official channels. Across town, Mrs. Halberd, newly energized by her close proximity to disaster, offered the incident an entirely different slant. In the greengrocer's queue, she confided to anyone within earshot that the lantern had not merely fallen, it had been snatched from the display. Her own eyes, she said, had observed a blur, a shadow, and possibly a gloved hand. When pressed on these details, she amended them with graceful vagueness. "It all happened so quickly," she murmured, implying that only someone with her refined instincts could have detected the sabotage at all. The butcher contributed another version before closing time, that the lantern had contained money. "Old Marion's too shrewd to bring a thing like that out unless she meant to show it off," he said, slicing lamb with meaningful precision. "But I reckon someone knew what was inside." When his assistant asked what that might have been, the butcher gave a long theatrical silence, then suggested it was not impossible. The lantern held insurance papers, a will, or perhaps a key to a lockbox. His audience expanded accordingly. By tea time, the news had reached the offices of the Flaxborough and District Advertiser, where young Peter Offenby, newly promoted to junior reporter and still bright enough to believe townsfolk told journalists the truth, planned a column, tentatively titled "Mischief at the Memorial Hall." His editor, Mr. Stodgeby, frowned at the draft, crossed out "mischief," and replaced it with "mysterious occurrence linked to railway relic." When Peter timidly pointed out that nothing had yet been linked, Stodgeby corrected him. "Young man, in journalism the link is the thing that gets made first." If the widow herself was the centre of this expanding storm, she behaved in the manner of someone who knew it was brewing and would have preferred it passed elsewhere. Neighbours observed she drew her curtains earlier than usual. One claimed she refused to answer the door for the milkman, which in Flaxborough bordered on a declaration of war. Another said she had lit no lamps at dusk, an irony not lost on those who remembered the lantern. But no neighbour could say for certain whether she had gone out. Flaxborough's habit of scrutiny was persistent, but not especially accurate. As for Inspector Purbright, he was aware of these developments only in the sense that one becomes aware of a draught in a room, not quite tangible but undeniably present. Information drifted toward him through the usual channels. Constable Sidwell's mother-in-law, an overheard remark at the post office, a note from the librarian apologetically prefaced with "not wanting to bother you, Inspector, but—" None of it amounted to more than smoke without fire, but Purbright was patient with smoke. It often revealed which way a breeze was blowing. He found the widow Fosdyke's quiet withdrawal particularly interesting. She was not by nature a shrinking woman. Her customary manner was brisk, decisive, and occasionally impatient. Yet now she moved like someone wishing to present as little surface area as possible to the town's attention. Her shrinking prompted 3 theories among those who watched her. First, that she was embarrassed by her clumsiness. Second, that she was protecting someone. Third, the favourite, that she was hiding something. Purbright, though he did not endorse any theory yet, did note a behavioural change. Marian Fosdyke was avoiding conversation, and those who avoided conversation in Flaxborough were usually those who feared being asked the wrong question. Meanwhile, at the police station, Sergeant Malley began filing the incident report with more gusto than it warranted. He included, with solemn handwriting, that the hook of the lantern appeared bent prior to the fall, possibly indicating interference. He then added a speculative note on the unknown man mentioned by the Perivales. Purbright gently removed that line. "We must avoid apportioning men in mackintoshes to every unexplained moment," he said mildly. Malley reddened. "Of course, sir. It's just folks do talk." "Indeed," Purbright replied. "They talk so much that we needn't hurry. The truth, with any luck, will try to keep up." It was early evening when the first genuinely curious development occurred. Mrs. Halberd, in her tireless circuit of the town's conversational centres, declared to her bridge club that the lantern had contained a document of some significance. When asked what sort, she leaned forward and said, "Something from Marian's husband's railway days, something compromising." She would not elaborate, which ensured her listeners elaborated for her. This version of events travelled unusually fast, perhaps because compromise was a currency Flaxborough understood better than sabotage. By the time it reached Purbright, via a circuitous route involving the chemist's wife and a cousin of the vicar, it had grown a detail he found quietly intriguing. Someone had claimed the lantern was moved earlier in the morning. Moved, not knocked. Not stolen. Moved. Purbright sat back in his office chair, fingers steepled, letting this alignment of stories settle in his mind. A stranger had supposedly lingered, a document had supposedly existed, a hand had supposedly been seen. All suppositions, all conveniently unverifiable. And yet one thin thread bound them: movement. Someone in all these retellings had been close enough to the lantern to disturb it. If only, Purbright thought, the talkative citizens of Flaxborough could be relied upon to agree on one detail. But they never did. And paradoxically, that inconsistency often revealed the person who wished hardest for the town to believe something specific. He rose, stretched, and reached for his hat once more. The gossip had done its circulation. Now it was time to see where the ripples pooled. And if Marian Fosdyke had indeed withdrawn into her house like a hedgehog into its winter nest, then perhaps she would prove more forthcoming in quieter circumstances, away from the memorial hall and its shattered relic. Purbright stepped out into the evening air, calm as ever, but with the faintest sense that the lantern's fall had loosened more than glass and metal. It had dislodged something in Flaxborough's sense of order, and in Marian Fosdyke herself. Inspector Purbright approached Widow Fosdyke's neat little terrace shortly after dusk, when the street lamps were neither fully convincing nor entirely decorative. Her curtains were drawn tight, but a faint glow escaped at the edges, enough to suggest she was home, though possibly not welcoming. He knocked once, gently, as though calling upon an elderly aunt rather than a witness to an oddly contentious piece of crockery damage. Marian answered after a notable delay. She stood with her shawl pulled tight, as if prepared to deny entry to winter itself. Her eyes widened a fraction at seeing Purbright, but she masked the reaction with practiced calm. "Inspector, I wasn't expecting tonight. I hope the hour isn't inconvenient." His tone implied it would not become inconvenient if she admitted it was. She stepped aside with the resigned politeness of someone allowing a doctor in to confirm the obvious. The interior was tidy, though not freshly so. A faint scent of lavender polish lingered, and framed railway photographs commanded pride of place above the mantel. Locomotives in various heroic poses, all presumably connected to her late husband's career. Yet Purbright sensed the room's order had been hurriedly imposed, a few too neat stacks of magazines, an Afghan folded so precisely that it suggested last-minute straightening. "I thought it best," Purbright said, settling into an upright armchair, "to ask a few questions without the bustle of the hall." Marian perched on the edge of her sofa. "Questions? I can't imagine what else needs saying." "It fell, Inspector. A stand is only a stand." "Yes, but it seems to have fallen rather interestingly." She stiffened. Purbright continued gently, "I wonder if you might recall whether anyone paused by your table longer than usual, not necessarily suspiciously, merely attentively." Her lips tightened. "People come and go. Some admire, some gossip. I didn't keep notes." "No doubt," Purbright said with a small smile, "but you seemed at the time to be looking for someone." He gave the observation in the mildest possible tone, as though discussing weather rather than motive. Her hand twitched, betraying what her face did not. "I was unsettled. The noise, the crowd. You mustn't read too much into it." "I rarely read too much into anything," Purbright murmured. "However, I am obliged to ask, have you had disagreements recently, with neighbours, acquaintances?" "Everyone in Flaxborough has disagreements," she said sharply. Then, catching herself, "No one who would push a lantern about." That she had not used the police's preferred phrasing, tamper with evidence, was telling. She spoke like someone choosing her words with care, avoiding deeper ones by instinct. Purbright did not press. He thanked her, allowed a comfortable silence to settle, and then rose to leave. "If anything comes to mind, anything no matter how small, do telephone." Her face softened a little. "Yes, I will." But when he stepped onto the street, he had the firm impression that Marian Fosdyke intended to telephone no one. His next call was on Mr. Cribb, the poultry enthusiast. Cribb lived in a bungalow overflowing with magazines about birds so elaborately plumed that they might have been invented. He opened the door at once, possibly because he had been watching from behind the curtain. "Inspector, come in, come in. Mind the newspaper. The budgerigar's been shredding." He swept an arm toward a sagging armchair. "Terrible business, that lantern. Terrible. You seemed quite certain in the hall that a draught caused its fall." Cribb coloured. "Well, I only meant, couldn't have been anyone near me. I'd have noticed. I always notice." Purbright glanced around at the chaotic piles of avian periodicals. "You strike me as observant." I absolutely am. He nodded vigorously, but I didn't see anyone touch it. Not directly. I may have seen a sleeve, or it might have been someone reaching for a jar. What colour was the sleeve? Cribby hesitated. Green or brown, something earthy. I didn't look closely. I was concentrating on keeping Mrs. Trench's Pekin hen from pecking my entry card. Very responsible of you. Crib beamed at the praise, visibly relieved to supply something harmless. Purbright asked a few more questions, gently, roundabout, but gleaned nothing concrete. Only that Crib was desperate not to be accused of anything at all, which in its way was a clue. Anxious men often noticed only their own anxiety. Mrs. Halberd, by contrast, noticed everything, everywhere, except accuracy. Inviting Purbright into her kitchen, she launched into a thorough recap of the incident, complete with miming gestures of hands grabbing at empty air. "And then," she said breathlessly, "just before it fell, I felt a presence. You might laugh, Inspector, but I have instincts about these things." "Instincts can be useful," Purbright said politely, "though occasionally misleading." "Well, I know what I saw." She leaned forward. Marion was standing very oddly beforehand, as though she expected it. That's what struck me. She wasn't surprised enough. Not surprised? Oh, she did the wide eyes and the hand to the chest, but it was too performed, like when Mrs. Charnley cries at funerals of people she's never met. Purbright considered this, not because he trusted Mrs. Halberd's sense of authenticity, very few rational people did, but because exaggerations often contained a small fossil of truth. "Did you speak to Mrs. Fosdyke before the fall?" he asked. "Only in passing. She was fussing with that ridiculous velvet cloth. Honestly, some women treat objects as though the objects might return the favour." "Did she move the lantern?" "She might have touched it, or she might have touched something near it." Mrs. Halberd sighed dramatically. "It's all quite blurred now, Inspector. These sorts of shocks do affect the memory." Purbright thanked her, though he suspected her memory had been affected by a lifetime of embroidery rather than any shock. His circuit concluded with a brief stop at the Memorial Hall, where the caretaker, Mr. Rudge, was sweeping up confetti-like fragments of beetroot wrapper left by earlier crowds. "Evening, Inspector. Come to inspect the damage again." "Just passing through," Purbright said. "Tell me, did anyone ask about Mrs. Fosdyke's table after we left?" Rudge scratched his cheek. "A chap did. Tall fellow, grey coat. Wanted to know where the lantern had landed." "And did you tell him?" "Course. Nothing secret about broken glass." Purbright looked at the now clean floorboards where the lantern had shattered. The space felt emptier than it should, as though something had been dislodged not merely from the stand, but from the town's careful equilibrium. "Did the fellow say why he was asking?" Purbright asked. Rudge shrugged. "Said he was curious. Folks get curious around breakages." "Yes," Purbright murmured. "They do." And as he stepped back into the night, the inspector felt the first faint stirrings of a pattern, not yet formed, not yet clear, but present. Several people had seen something. None had seen the same thing, yet between their accounts ran a thinner thread. Someone else had been near the lantern, someone who had not yet spoken to him. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station the next morning to find Sergeant Malley standing at his desk with the air of a man who possessed news he believed both urgent and impressive. Malley straightened the moment Purbright entered, chest expanding like a startled pigeon. "Sir," Malley announced, "we may have our man." Purbright removed his hat with leisurely calm. "Oh, how fortunate. Usually we wait several days before someone volunteers." "It's Councillor Pook, sir. He's been ringing the station since 8 o'clock asking why we haven't questioned Edgar Blunn yet." Purbright paused, mid-motion of hanging his hat. Blun. Yes, sir. The widow's neighbour. According to Pook, Blun's had a long-standing argument with Mrs. Fosdyke over hedge boundaries, compost smells, and, I'm quoting, the general moral decay of widows who live alone. Charming. Purbright moved toward the kettle. And Councillor Pook feels this animosity translates into lantern tampering. Mally nodded vigorously. Says Blun's always looking for ways to irritate her. Claims he's jealous of her railway pension. Says Blun once reported her for overusing her outdoor tap. Purbright gave a soft the kind that suggested the inspector was arranging the information into tidy but unconvincing piles. Did Councillor Pook witness anything at the show? No, sir. He wasn't there, but he says Blun was. Convenient. Purbright filled the kettle with an expression that was not quite skepticism, but very near it. Has Blun been notified of his new notoriety? Mally scratched his cheek. He rang in himself, sir. Wants to lodge a complaint. Says Pook's been spreading slander around the town. Purbright's smile was almost imperceptible. Then perhaps we should see him. Edgar Blun lived 3 streets from the widow, in a house that appeared to have been assembled from rejection bins at a brickyard. The man himself answered the door with the expression of someone who had opened it too many times already that morning and expected no good from further interruptions. Inspector Purbright, he grumbled. I suppose you're here about that blasted lantern. Purbright offered a gentle nod. Only to clarify a few things, Mr. Blun. Well, you can clarify this. He jabbed a finger toward the road. I haven't touched that woman's belongings in years. Wouldn't go near them. Wouldn't go near her unless paid. Very prudent, Purbright said pleasantly. May we come in? Blun grudged them entry into a living room cluttered with model ships, half-read newspapers, and an armchair whose stuffing had made several attempts at escape. He thumped into a seat opposite them. Councillor Pook, Purbright began, seems to believe there is tension between you and Mrs. Fosdyke. Tension? Blun barked. She's impossible. Complains about my hedge being too tall, then begs me not to cut it because the sparrows nest there. Complains my wireless is too loud even when it's not on. Complains my tabby looks at her funny. Purbright waited out the tirade with his customary patience. But you attended the memorial hall yesterday? Blun sniffed. I did. My cousin had an entry in the pickled beetroot category. First and last time I'll accompany him. Place reeked of vinegar and misguided pride. And did you go near the widow's table? Why would I? He folded his arms against any hint of sensibility. Barely glanced in her direction. I knew she'd assume I'd come to sneer. Truth is, I couldn't care less about her lantern. Probably cost £half and she calls it heirloom. So you didn't touch it? Or the table? Blun's indignation flared like a match. No! And if Pook says I did, he can come here and tell me to my face. The man's as crooked as his own front teeth. Purbright inclined his head. It may comfort you to know that Councillor Pook has furnished us with no evidence, only enthusiasm. This deflated Blun slightly. Oh, well, good, because I've been up since dawn telling people I didn't do it. Have you an alibi for the time of the fall? Blun hesitated. I was outside the hall, getting some air. For how long? 10 minutes, maybe 15. Alone? No, the vicar's wife was outside too. Blun's voice became defensive. She came out saying the brass band was upsetting her nerves. I nodded, she nodded, and that was that. Purbright blinked once in mild surprise. The vicar's wife was a soft-spoken, reliably discreet woman who rarely placed herself in proximity to public fuss. That Blun claimed her as witness could be either fortunate coincidence or crafted alliance. And she will confirm this? Purbright asked. I expect so. She's honest. Purbright stood, offering a polite smile. "Thank you, Mr. Blunn. You've been very helpful. Does this mean you won't be charging me with whatever it is Pook's blathering about?" "It means," Purbright said kindly, "that truth often needs more than one morning to assemble itself." Outside, Mally released a breath he'd been holding. "He seemed very sure of himself, sir." "He seemed," Purbright corrected gently, "very sure that we should not question him further." "You think he's lying?" "I think," Purbright said, setting off down the street, "that convenient suspects rarely arrive without someone delivering them." Mally frowned. "Meaning Pook?" "Meaning Pook," Purbright agreed, "and meaning Blunn's unexpected alibi." "You don't trust the vicar's wife?" "I trust her entirely," Purbright said, "which is precisely why I must ask why she chose to stand outside the hall with Edgar Blunn of all people." Mally rubbed his head. "Maybe she needed air." "Possibly." Purbright's voice held a faint, thoughtful warmth. "Or possibly she needed to be seen giving air to someone else." The sergeant blinked. "That sounds like you don't think Mr. Blunn's our man." "I suspect," Purbright said gently, "that he is no one's man, not even his own." "And the lantern?" Purbright looked down the street as though expecting the widow's broken relic to reassemble itself in the distance. "The lantern," he said quietly, "fell too conveniently to land at Blunn's feet." He resumed walking. "Someone," he added, "wants us to think very quickly, which is why we mustn't." Inspector Purbright returned to the station with Blunn's indignant sputtering still lingering pleasantly in his ears. The man's certainty, though comically overinflated, had contained something worth noting. Blunn was not inventive. If he had wished to lie, his lie would have tripped over its own shoelaces long before reaching a respectable alibi. Yet the vicar's wife, a woman whose honesty was almost architectural, had stepped into the role with suspicious neatness. And neatness, in matters of human behavior, rarely suited truth. He sat down at his desk, reached for the small envelope containing the broken lantern's metal fittings, and tipped the pieces gently onto blotting paper. The hook caught the light as it fell, glinting like a tiny crooked finger. Bent inward, bent deliberately. A delicate thing, the hook, not the sort to warp under its own weight, nor from an accidental knock. Someone had pressed it, twisted it, or attempted to pry something from it. Purbright lifted it with tweezers, studying it with a small frown of polite interest, the way a man might regard a piece of pastry whose ingredients did not quite match its flavour. Sergeant Mally entered, pausing when he saw the fragments. "Still looking at the hook, sir?" "Still," Purbright replied quietly. "It troubles me." Mally rubbed the back of his neck. Could have just been someone bumping the stand. A bag, an elbow. Folk don't watch where they're going at these fairs. "This did not bend outward," Purbright said. "It bent in." Mally stared. "Meaning someone pulled it? Or hung something from it?" Purbright murmured. "What sort of something?" "That," Purbright said, "is the question, but Mrs. Fosdyke did not display it as an ornament only. She treated it as though its position mattered, and when it fell she didn't look surprised. She looked afraid." Mally shifted uncomfortably. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think she is hiding the reason she is hiding something." He set the hook down, which is more troublesome than the thing itself. A knock sounded at the office door, and Constable Sidwell poked his head in. "Sir, Mrs. Penworthy's downstairs, says she has important information." "Ah," Purbright said, straightening. "The town conscience." Mrs. Penworthy breezed in moments later like a ship under full sail, hat trembling with righteous wind. She leaned forward before even sitting. Inspector, I must tell you, I saw that widow's lantern yesterday morning before the fair opened. Purbright inclined his head. How fortunate. And how did it look? Wrong. She sat primly. It was hanging, not sitting. Purbright felt a faint stirring of interest. Hanging? From what, Mrs. Penworthy? A nail on the side partition. I saw it when I passed through to check the church charity table. She lowered her voice dramatically. Someone must have moved it. Are you certain it was the widow's? It had that same ridiculous brass cage. I remember thinking it looked entirely out of place in a poultry hall. And was anyone near it? A man, she said with relish. Tall, grey coat, thin, the sort who looks as though he writes letters of complaint for pleasure. Did he touch the lantern? Mrs. Penworthy hesitated, just long enough for Purbright to mark the hesitation as the moment where truth and embellishment attempted to bargain. He stood very close, she said, very close indeed. Purbright thanked her, guiding her gently through the rest of her theatrics until she left, satisfied that she had contributed meaningfully to justice. When the door shut, he let out a soft breath. Mally spoke first. Same description as the man Rudge mentioned. Purbright murmured. A tall man in a grey coat. Our elusive ghost. Do you believe her? I believe she saw a lantern, Purbright said. Whether it was the lantern is a matter we cannot yet settle. And the man? People in grey coats become more numerous in memory than they ever are in fact. Mally scratched his head. But if the lantern really was hanging earlier, then it moved twice, Purbright finished softly. Once to the partition, once to the table. He returned the hook to its envelope. Let us visit the memorial hall again. The caretaker, Mr. Rudge, was sweeping the vestibule with the dedicated gloom of a man convinced that dust reappeared purely out of spite. Morning again, Inspector. More lantern business? Only a small point, Purbright said. Was this partition always bare? He tapped the side panel Mrs. Penworthy had described. Yesterday it was, Rudge said, unless someone stuck something on it and pulled it down quick. No nail, no hook. None. I'd have seen it. Thank you, Purbright said, untroubled. Memory is a fascinating creature. Rudge grinned sheepishly. Folk round here do love seeing what isn't there. Quite. Purbright walked the length of the hall slowly, letting his gaze drift over the tables now stripped of decorations. When he reached the section where the widow's display had been, he stopped. The trestle table was still faintly smudged with velvet fibres. He placed his hand on the edge, giving the slightest experimental pressure. The table wobbled, but the tilt was away from the fall's direction in the hall's recollections. A lantern perched on this corner would most likely slide backward, not forward. Mally watched. Does that mean someone pushed it? Possibly, Purbright said, or possibly someone moved the stand itself, an inch here, an inch there. But why? That, Purbright said, brings us back to the smallest question. He let the silence hang. What was the lantern for? Mally blinked. Decorating the stall? Mrs. Fosdyke does not decorate with railway memorabilia at random, Purbright replied. The lantern had a purpose. It was positioned with purpose, and when it fell, she feared the consequences more than the loss. He walked slowly toward the door, each step quiet with thought. She wanted it seen, he murmured, but not examined. Mally frowned. Could have been sentimental. Sentiment bends no hooks, Purbright said gently. A draught stirred as they stepped outside, a mild breeze carrying the faint smell of sawdust and old chutney from the emptied hall. Purbright paused, gazing down the quiet street, the broken hook's mystery now lodged keenly in his mind. Someone had touched that lantern before it fell. someone who understood what was hidden, or what might be suspected to be hidden, and someone who very much wanted Flaxborough talking about anything except that tiny, out-of-place bend in the metal. The morning after Purbright's careful inspection of the bent hook, Flaxborough exhibited its usual combination of calm streets and quietly seething curiosity. The scent of damp leaves and coal smoke clung to the air as he walked toward the memorial hall once more, this time with the deliberate intent of observing the subtle motions of people rather than the fall of a single object. He was aware that a small detail, noticed too late, might shift the whole inquiry. By the entrance to the hall, he noted a young man with spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, scribbling in a notebook. Purbright had not seen him at the fair the previous day. His jacket bore a patch indicating some obscure railway enthusiast society, and his eyes darted with a particular intensity that suggested either deep interest or a carefully concealed anxiety. "Morning," Purbright said in his mildest tone. "I don't believe we met yesterday." The man looked up, startled, then gave a nervous nod. "I'm Alfred Hemming, visiting Flaxborough for the exhibition. I study historical railway lanterns. Heard about the Fosdyke piece and thought it might be of interest." "Indeed," Purbright said, "though the lantern seems at present to be broken." "Yes," Hemming said hurriedly. "I understand. I only hope it was handled with care." His eyes flickered toward the fragments still gathered by the caretaker, Mr. Rudge. Purbright nodded. "We shall attend to them shortly. And you're aware that yesterday's events have inspired much discussion." Hemming's expression hardened slightly. "I prefer to rely on facts rather than discussion." Purbright noted the emphasis and stored it alongside the man's unusual alertness. At the opposite side of the hall, Purbright observed a trim, middle-aged woman arranging flower pots on a small table. She was unfamiliar to him as well, though her hands moved with meticulous precision and a faint impatience, as if she believed every plant should take its assigned place at once. She introduced herself at the slightest invitation. "I'm Mrs. Fenton, hairdresser," she said, and the words carried a small flourish of territorial pride. "I came yesterday to watch the proceedings. I overheard raised voices near the Fosdyke stall." "Raised voices?" Purbright asked, noting the precision in her speech. "You could identify the participants?" "Not clearly, just fragments. One sounded agitated, another defensive. It caught my attention, that's all." "Indeed?" Purbright inclined his head. "It seems the hall has an abundance of unnoticed witnesses." Mrs. Fenton smiled faintly. "I suppose so. I like to notice things others overlook." And that, Purbright reflected, was precisely why she might know more than she admitted. He made a slow circuit of the hall, noting minor damage to trestle legs, a scattering of sawdust from a hastily replaced floorboard, and the subtle traces of scuff marks near the widow's former display. Each small observation compounded the peculiar tableau of yesterday's events. By mid-morning he was approached by a timid clerk, a young man employed at the local bank. His uniform was neat, his hands jittery, as he handed Purbright a folded sheet of paper. "Inspector, sir," he stammered, "I saw something yesterday that may or may not be of interest. I didn't think to tell anyone until now." Purbright unfolded the paper. The clerk's handwriting was careful, almost painfully so. It described a person carrying what appeared to be a duplicate lantern earlier in the morning, placed momentarily near the widow's stall, then removed quickly. The clerk's note emphasized that the individual was unidentified and moved with purposeful steps. He included the approximate time and direction, the latter toward the rear exit of the hall. "Very thorough," Purbright said. "And you are certain of this?" "I believe so, sir. But I might have misjudged distances." "Every small detail can be helpful," Purbright said. "Even uncertain distances sometimes point the way." The clerk's face brightened with a faint blush of approval. He excused himself and scuttled off, leaving Purbright to consider the new piece of the puzzle. Someone had arrived early, carrying a duplicate lantern, and departed before the main incident. A subtle twist. The widow's piece had been only one of two, an entirely deliberate placement or an odd coincidence? Purbright's mind began to knit together the sequence of minor events. He reviewed the new faces: Hemming, the enthusiastic railway historian; Mrs. Fenton, the sharp-eyed hairdresser; the clerk, an unassuming observer whose note suggested he noticed what others had missed; and of course the town's older witnesses, the Perivales and Mrs. Halberd, whose exaggerations and instincts had coloured the morning. Each figure added a new vector of possible motives and observations. None appeared overtly culpable, yet all bore signs of personal investment in the unfolding narrative. Hemming's professional interest in lanterns could easily mask other intentions. Mrs. Fenton's attentiveness to detail might conceal a longer memory or a hidden grievance. The clerk's youthful timidity could allow him to misplace importance in trivialities, or reveal a fact no one else had dared to observe. Purbright traced a slow path along the former site of the Fosdyke stall. Velvet fibres clung faintly to the trestle edges. The metal hook rested on blotting paper at the station, a minor piece, but indicative. And now the idea of a duplicate lantern made the sequence far less straightforward. Someone had premeditated a display, or perhaps misdirection, the act of moving, of presenting, of letting the lantern fall. All could carry layered meanings. Outside, the hall's doors opened to reveal the quiet flow of Flaxborough's street. Shopkeepers adjusted their awnings against a light drizzle, and townsfolk wandered past in deliberate nonchalance. To the casual observer, nothing remarkable had occurred. But to Purbright, the presence of these new, seemingly incidental participants indicated the web of observation and action had grown more intricate than a simple accident. Each individual, through their own habits and concerns, had contributed a tiny ripple to the unfolding events. By the time Purbright returned to the station, he had formulated a cautious plan. The morning's observations revealed an emerging pattern, one of repetition, one of subtlety, and one of very deliberate timing. Each new participant offered a window, sometimes half-shuttered, sometimes wide open, into the sequence that had caused the widow's lantern to shatter. And yet none had fully grasped the connections, leaving the inspector the quiet advantage. He settled into his chair, letting the half-formed sequence swirl in his mind. Historical knowledge, attentiveness, and minor interventions combined in curious ways. In Flaxborough, the most unassuming people could wield influence over events larger than themselves, and the smallest detail, unnoticed, might later illuminate the intention behind even the most delicate of actions. Purbright considered the path forward, careful observation of those now known, subtle questioning, and patience. The morning had introduced new vectors, new possibilities, and perhaps a faint hint of mischief or misdirection, intentionally seeded among the crowd. The web of participants, old and new, promised complexity, and the promise of insight for anyone willing to watch closely. By mid-afternoon he leaned back and sipped his tea, allowing a faint smile to touch his lips. The town had assembled itself like a miniature stage, each actor unaware of the role they had been given, and at the centre of it, the broken lantern remained less an object than a signal, a prompt, a key to unraveling the subtle interplay of human curiosity, pride, and caution. It was not until the evening of the third day that the second disturbance occurred, and it was of a type entirely unexpected. Purbright had spent the afternoon reviewing the notes and observations collected so far. The bent hook, the duplicate lantern, the conflicting recollections of various townspeople, and the careful, almost theatrical retreat of Widow Fosdyke into her home. Flaxborough seemed, for a moment, to have resumed its ordinary rhythm, yet such calm was deceptive. The town's own nervous energy seldom permitted serenity to persist. Purbright had returned to the Memorial Hall briefly to examine the hall floor and edges of the trestles, checking for marks or scratches overlooked in previous visits. He observed the softening light through the hall windows and the quietness of the emptied space. There was a mild scent of old vinegar and sawdust, as though the day itself had absorbed the memories of the fair. When he left, he felt that the hall was waiting, not inanimate, but expectant, as though it knew the sequence of events was far from concluded. The first report came via the police telephone at precisely 7:30. It was Sergeant Malley, breathless and subdued. "Sir, Mrs. Fosdyke's shed, sir. Someone's been there." Purbright adjusted his hat and moved toward the street with calm deliberation. "Broken locks?" "No, sir. That's the odd part. Nothing is missing, but there's a timetable, old soot-stained, on the workbench. From her late husband's railway days, folded neatly, not placed carelessly. Someone returned it deliberately." The inspector's mind began its quiet ticking. "And Mrs. Fosdyke?" "She's anxious. She says she did not touch it. She's not sure who could have left it." By the time he reached her small terrace, the widow was standing by the gate, shawl drawn tightly, eyes wary, cheeks flushed with unease. "Inspector," she said as he approached, It's back?" "Yes," Purbright said gently, stepping onto the small path. "I understand." "The timetable," she whispered. "It was from the old railway schedule, from the days when things were different. Someone has returned it, though I don't know why." Purbright tilted his head, considering the object and its implications. "Did you leave it outside the hall?" he asked. "No, it was never in the hall to my knowledge. It was in the shed. I found it there this morning, untouched. But tonight it was folded, placed on my workbench. I did not touch it." Purbright's gaze softened but remained thoughtful. "And you are certain of the times?" "Yes," she said, almost pleading. "I locked the shed this morning, returned after tea, found it so." He glanced at the small, soot-stained sheet of paper. The dates printed on it were decades old, almost ceremonial in their dryness. Yet someone had handled it recently, carefully, almost reverently. That care indicated intent. "Who could have done this?" Marion asked, her voice small, betraying the anxiety she tried to mask behind composure. Purbright did not answer immediately. He observed the small folds of the paper, the way the light reflected off the slight creases and the methodical order in which it had been placed. Whoever had done this understood that the act would be noticed. It was meant to convey a message, though the message remained opaque. Sergeant Malley, arriving behind Purbright, added the logistical detail. "Lock secure, sir. No footprints near the workbench beyond the shed's own threshold." "Meaning," Purbright said softly, "someone entered and left with care, deliberately avoiding all traces." Marion's lips pressed tightly together. "But why? It makes no sense. Nothing is missing. Nothing was disturbed." "Perhaps," Purbright said, "because what is significant is not the taking, but the presentation. Some gestures are designed to provoke reflection, not theft." Her eyes widened. "Reflection? By whom?" "That," Purbright said with faint precision, "remains to be determined." He examined the folds of the timetable once more. The soot suggested proximity to fire or embers. A fireplace, perhaps, though the house itself bore none immediately near the shed. The presence of soot indicated either deliberate misdirection or the object had been handled elsewhere before its placement. "Inspector," Malley said uneasily, "this seems deliberate and targeted." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Observe, Sergeant, the care, the folding, the location. No ordinary vandal leaves a message so meticulously." Marion shivered slightly, though she maintained her composure. "Do you think someone is threatening me?" Purbright shook his head softly. "Not threatening, Mrs. Fosdyke. Reminding someone that the past lingers, even when invisible. That is why it is placed where it will be seen, yet not stolen." "But why?" Her voice broke at last, betraying the fear she had held in check. Purbright gave her the faintest smile, courteous, disarming, yet firmly controlled. "Because the past, even a small, soot-stained sheet of paper, can exert influence in ways the present cannot." Outside, a light drizzle began, leaving the narrow street slick and reflective. The widow looked toward the darkening windows of the hall across the square. The memorial hall, quiet and unassuming now, had hosted not only a broken lantern, but the subtle insinuation of human intent. Someone had returned an item, carefully, knowing that it would unsettle. And in Flaxborough, unsettlement was an art form practiced as routinely as gossip. Purbright folded his hands and regarded the widow without overt scrutiny. "Do not touch the sheet again," he advised, "until we have considered the full chain of events." She nodded mutely, relief mingled with apprehension. The inspector's quiet authority had, as always, brought a measure of calm. Malley followed Purbright toward the station in silence. "Sir, what now? Someone is moving things around, leaving traces. Could it be connected to the lantern?" "Certainly," Purbright said. "Every incident we have observed, the bent hook, the duplicate lantern, the careful placement of this timetable, forms part of a pattern. A person capable of patience, attention, and subtle manipulation. One who understands the town, its people, and the quiet effect of deliberate actions." He paused, considering the quiet street. "We are no longer dealing with a simple accident. We are observing intention. And in Flaxborough, as elsewhere, intention leaves traces, not always obvious, but detectable if one watches closely." Malley shivered. "Detectable, but not easily understood." "Precisely," Purbright said, his gaze drifting toward the darkened windows of the hall. "Which is why patience, observation, and subtlety will reveal what clumsiness cannot. Let the town chatter. We shall follow the facts." The two men entered the station quietly. Outside, Flaxborough continued its evening routines, unaware that the second disturbance, subtle, deliberate, and perplexing, had shifted the course of events entirely. And in that subtle shift, Purbright saw not chaos, but the faint outlines of a design waiting to be traced to its source. Inspector Purbright spent the following morning in quiet contemplation at his desk, surveying the fragments of a case that had grown far more intricate than a simple, shattered lantern. The memorial hall lay behind him, modest in size, yet it had hosted a sequence of subtle gestures and human anxieties that, taken together, seemed to form a pattern deliberately constructed to test the bounds of propriety. He sipped tea in silence, considering not the object itself, but the people and the impulses that had turned the object into a symbol. Flaxborough was a town thoroughly committed to appearances. Respectability was observed not merely as a social expectation, but as a defensive armor. It dictated the positioning of trestle tables, the manner in which preserves were presented, and the careful avoidance of neighbors' gazes when a disagreement over a hedgerow might otherwise flare. Every participant in yesterday's incident had acted in accordance with such unspoken rules, whether consciously or not. And Purbright noted it was precisely this adherence, this careful weaving of civility, that could conceal subtle intentions from the casual observer. Marion Fosdyke's retreat into her home after the lantern's fall illustrated the point with precision. Her composure was polished, her withdrawal complete, yet her anxiety betrayed her. She did not wish the town to witness disarray, yet she could not entirely hide her knowledge that something more than chance had occurred. In that tension lay a quiet theatre, the display of propriety masking the flickering uncertainty of human motives. She had kept her composure, but the moment of broken glass had revealed that the past and the present were never entirely separable. Purbright considered the other figures who had emerged in the investigation. Mr. Cribb, the bird fancier, had demonstrated anxiety not about truth but about personal reputation. Mrs. Halberd, ever vigilant and opinionated, had served both as witness and amplifier of communal perception, shaping the narrative by her insistence that events were more dramatic than they truly were. The vicar's wife, by contrast, maintained discreet observation and judicious interposition, her conduct guided by a combination of morality and the town's expectation that decorum must be preserved at all costs. Even Councillor Pooke, with his emphatic certainty, acted in accordance with his conception of civic propriety, seeking to assign blame neatly and publicly in order to maintain a personal sense of order. What connected them all, Purbright realized, was a form of tacit social contract, the manipulation of appearances, the careful choreography of speech, gesture, and timing, to maintain one's reputation while observing those of others. It was in such an environment that human behavior could appear incoherent or contradictory, yet yield subtle traces for those trained to notice. The bent hook, the return timetable, the duplicate lantern, all spoke less of the objects themselves than of the network of anxieties surrounding them. He examined the small metal hook again, lying innocuously on his blotting paper. Its bend, so slight as to appear trivial, carried implications that extended beyond mere physical deformation. Someone had engaged with it purposefully, and yet no one wished to admit awareness. The act was minor, almost inconsequential, yet its significance emerged in the pattern of restraint and precision observable among the town's inhabitants. Purbright reflected on the nature of influence. Small, deliberate interventions, performed by individuals aware of the consequences, could yield disturbances far beyond their immediate scale. He leaned back and let his gaze wander to the window where the early November light struck the station's tiled floor in narrow, angled bands. In these rays he saw metaphorical representations of the town's behavior, narrow glimpses, selective illumination, half-visible truths. Each person's observances, actions, and evasions cast shadows that extended beyond the immediate scene, creating a latticework of knowledge and misconception. Understanding these patterns required not mere attention to events, but an appreciation for the subtle pressures shaping human decisions. Even in trivial disputes, there existed a hierarchy of propriety, fear, and pride that could determine outcomes more effectively than any overt confrontation. Purbright considered the notion of deliberately returned items. The soot-stained timetable, carefully folded, had been placed to be discovered, yet the act of placing it was governed by unspoken rules. The intruder had respected the widow's property to a degree, had avoided detection, and had ensured the effect would be observed. The object's movement was not theft but communication, and communication within the boundaries of propriety carried its own constraints. Flaxborough, for all its bustling curiosity, would interpret the act as strange, noteworthy, but would resist acknowledging malice outright, for malice conflicted with appearances. He reflected as well on timing. Every gesture observed thus far, from the drop of the lantern to the placement of the timetable, had been executed in a context of careful calculation. The individuals involved had acted with knowledge of others' perceptions, yet sought to remain invisible to formal scrutiny. In such a setting, human intention could be traced not only through observation of action, but through anticipation of reactions, management of social signals, and the orchestration of circumstances to shape outcomes subtly. Understanding this was crucial to resolving the case. The patterns lay not only in what was done, but in what the participants sought to conceal or reveal. There was, too, the question of the widow herself. Marion Fosdyke had, perhaps unwittingly, performed a series of small acts to protect herself, maintain appearances, and possibly shield some private knowledge. Her reactions were consistent with someone who understood the social consequences of misperception. A broken lantern was inconvenient, but a perceived slight or revelation could be devastating. Purbright noted that the anxiety she displayed was careful and controlled, consistent with a person attuned to propriety, yet constrained by personal stakes. Observing the behavior of those around her, Cribb, Halberd, Blunn, Pook, one could see the same careful negotiation between self-interest and social expectation. Each small gesture became a part of a larger lattice of conduct. By mid-afternoon, Purbright's reflection had coalesced into a guiding principle. The resolution of the case would not arise from the recovery of missing objects, nor from confessions secured through intimidation. It would emerge from attention to human habits, small inconsistencies, and the subtle motives that governed conduct in a town where reputation was paramount. The past had exerted itself in minor, deliberate ways. The present had responded predictably, filtered through propriety. Understanding this interplay would illuminate the actions of each participant, revealing the hidden sequence behind what, to casual observers, appeared as random mishaps and curious coincidences. Purbright took up the small metal hook once more, handling it with delicate care. A seemingly trivial object, yet pregnant with information, it symbolized the complex interactions of intention, observation, and social restraint. The next steps would require patience, careful attention, and the use of subtle methods to elicit truth. In Flaxborough, direct confrontation was rarely fruitful. Understanding arrived through quiet observation, gentle prodding, and the patient unraveling of human behavior behind the mask of propriety. The town's respectability, its obsession with appearances, had produced patterns and clues subtle enough to mislead all but the most attentive observer. Leaning back in his chair, Purbright allowed a faint, approving smile to touch his lips. The town, with its small grievances, hidden loyalties, and social choreography, was slowly revealing its structure. And the widow's lantern, bent hook, soot-stained timetable, and other minutiae would serve as keys to unraveling the intentions hidden within the layers of civility and pretense. Understanding respectability, he reflected, was understanding the invisible architecture of human behavior. In Flaxborough, nothing was as simple as it seemed, and everything, if observed carefully, could illuminate the truth. The morning following his reflections on respectability, Inspector Purbright decided it was time to apply a more deliberate, though entirely understated, tactic. The various threads of observation, the bent lantern hook, the returned timetable, the duplicate lantern, and the cautious movements of witnesses and participants alike, had formed a pattern sufficiently suggestive of intent, yet no one involved had admitted knowledge beyond what decorum demanded, and some had actively withheld it. Purbright understood that in Flaxborough, subtlety was often the most persuasive tool. He began by inviting Widow Fosdyke to the station for a brief, routine discussion, couched in entirely innocuous terms. A polite inquiry into her recollections, framed as assistance in clarifying her own observations. She arrived promptly, her shawl adjusted with the precision of someone accustomed to presenting propriety even in private. Her eyes, though, betrayed a flicker of unease, the kind that occurred when one expected to be asked questions one was unprepared to answer. "Good morning, Mrs. Fosdyke," Purbright said, seating her in the chair opposite his desk. "I hope you slept well." "Fairly well," she admitted, her voice cautious, "though I confess the incident of the lantern continues to trouble me." "I understand," Purbright said softly. "Even when the object itself is trivial, the implications can linger. May I ask if you recall anyone approaching the table before the lantern fell? Even someone whose presence seemed insignificant at the time?" Marian paused, frowning slightly. "There were many people. I only noticed them fleetingly. Some observers, some neighbors, some strangers. One or two lingered, but I did not pay attention to them closely." Purbright inclined his head. "Understandable. Observation is selective, especially amid the commotion of a fair. Perhaps we might discuss the smaller details. For instance, the position of the lantern on the stand. Was it central or closer to the edge?" Marian adjusted her shawl. "Closer to the center? I had taken care to place it securely." "Of course," Purbright said. "And yet it fell. You were startled, naturally." "Yes, but—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Not as much as I should have been, I suppose. I was more concerned about who might have seen it." "That is a perceptive thought," Purbright replied gently. "Sometimes attention to perception is as significant as the event itself." Marian blinked, caught by the subtle guidance in his tone. "I suppose so." Purbright allowed a brief pause, then spoke of the small, soot-stained railway timetable returned to her shed. "You received this last evening?" "Yes," she admitted. "Placed carefully on my workbench. I did not touch it before your arrival." "An intriguing choice of presentation," Purbright observed. "Not theft, nor mischief, but deliberate communication." Marian shivered lightly. "Yes, that is how it felt." "And it seems prudent," Purbright said, "to consider all those present at the fair in terms of their awareness, familiarity with your habits, and sensitivity to social cues." She nodded, a little reluctantly, understanding the direction of his questions without feeling any immediate pressure. He was not yet accusing. He was subtly nudging her to revisit what she had observed, but not spoken aloud. Later, Purbright arranged a brief meeting at the hall, inviting a small selection of participants who had previously given contradictory or incomplete accounts: the widow, Mr. Cribb, and Mrs. Fenton, the hairdresser. He framed the session as a routine follow-up for the sake of accuracy, emphasizing communal interest rather than suspicion. The meeting was casual, chairs around the hall's small conference table, afternoon light spilling through high windows, dust motes suspended in the quiet air. On the table, he allowed the idea of the lantern to linger without formal introduction, speaking instead of items whose handling matters to their owners. Purbright encouraged light conversation about the fair, the displays, the birds, and the flowers, permitting participants to speak freely. Mrs. Fenton contributed precise observations about the arrangement of tables, while Mr. Cribb reiterated his attentiveness to every bird in his charge. The widow spoke sparingly, but with greater candour than she had at the station. She referenced fleeting moments, glances she had not shared before, hesitations in movement that had escaped immediate notice. Purbright made careful note. At a strategically chosen moment, he observed a small, involuntary reaction. The widow's hands tightened briefly on her lap when a comment was made about the precise placement of items on trestle tables. Purbright allowed the moment to pass, then shifted the conversation slightly to discuss minor gestures and habits, innocuously querying which participants might have observed more closely than others. The question was indirect, framed as curiosity rather than interrogation, but it was designed to test the boundaries of honesty. The widow's expression changed subtly. A tension crept into her eyes, a micro-adjustment in posture, a hesitation before speaking. These were not dramatic gestures, but to Purbright they were signals. She knew something, and the careful arrangement of his questioning had brought it just close enough to the surface for him to note. "People often do not realize," Purbright said quietly, "how a seemingly insignificant observation, a glance, a momentary pause, can reveal more than the act itself." Marian nodded as though agreeing in principle, but the faint tightening of her lips suggested she also understood that someone had seen her, or something she had left unsaid, more clearly than she intended. "Sometimes," Purbright continued, allowing his words to drift gently, without focus on any one individual, "the intention behind an action is more telling than the outcome. A careful observer can often reconstruct a sequence of events from subtle reactions if they know where to look." He let the statement hang in the air, not drawing attention to anyone, yet allowing all present to feel the implication. Mrs. Fenton looked thoughtful. Mr. Cribb blinked several times, and Marian's eyes flickered to a corner of the room, where light fell across a smooth, empty surface. By the end of the meeting, Purbright had achieved precisely what he intended. No accusation had been made, no pressure applied beyond gentle guidance. Yet the widow had been prompted to reconsider the precise moments of the fair, the presence of other individuals near her display, and the timing of certain gestures. Small contradictions, previously unarticulated, had surfaced in her mind. Subtle discomfort had revealed awareness she had not yet shared aloud. He had nudged, not forced, the truth closer to daylight. As the participants departed, each carrying their observations and unvoiced thoughts back into the wider town, Purbright remained seated for a moment, reflecting. The quiet nudge had not produced confession, nor immediate clarity, but it had begun to illuminate the structure of observation, attention, and deliberate omission. In Flaxborough, as elsewhere, the path to understanding often passed through careful orchestration of perception rather than direct confrontation. He allowed himself a faint smile. The stage had been set, and the next act would require only that the participants perform according to their own inclinations. Purbright rose and adjusted his hat. The afternoon light fell across the empty table, highlighting the polished wood and subtle imperfections, a silent record of gestures and glances. The widow's subtle unease, Mr. Cribb's vigilant attentiveness, Mrs. Fenton's precision, each now bore significance. The sequence of events, once opaque, was beginning to emerge through the lens of observation, timing, and human nature. He walked to the doorway, stepping into the street where the town carried on, largely unaware of the quiet, deliberate movement within the hall. Somewhere in that mixture of propriety, pride, and restrained observation lay the path to discovery, and Purbright knew that one careful nudge was often enough to set in motion the revelation of subtle truths. By the following afternoon, Inspector Purbright had gathered the key participants into his modest office for what he termed, in the gentlest possible terms, a review of events. The widow, Mr. Cribb, Mrs. Fenton, and, through a careful arrangement, Edgar Blunn had all been invited under the guise of clarifying minor points for the record. The air was calm, punctuated only by the occasional scratch of a pen or the distant tolling of the church bell. Outside, Flaxborough moved as usual, unaware that the final threads of yesterday's disruptions were about to be drawn together. Purbright had arranged the room with minimal formality, chairs positioned in a loose semicircle, a table for notes, and a quiet corner for the small remnants of the lantern's hook and the soot-stained timetable. Nothing appeared extraordinary. The setting was ordinary in every sense, designed to encourage observation without provocation. The participants entered one by one, each bearing the habitual politeness expected of Flaxborough citizens, yet each displaying in micro-adjustments of posture and gaze their own interest in the proceedings. He began by speaking softly, his tone casual, almost conversational. "Thank you all for attending. The purpose today is simply to ensure that the record of events surrounding the Fosdyke display is accurate and complete. Minor discrepancies, if any, are of interest only to clarify the sequence of events." Mrs. Fenton shifted slightly, adjusting her posture as though to emphasize her attentiveness. Mr. Cribb tapped the armrest of his chair, a faint twitch betraying both anticipation and nervous vigilance. Widow Fosdyke sat with her hands folded in her lap, maintaining composure, yet her eyes, sharp and alert, tracked every movement. Blunn leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, an expression alternating between irritation and mild curiosity. Purbright allowed a moment of silence, then gestured toward the hook. "This small object," he began, lifting it gently, "has been central to much of the discussion. Bent, yes, but not by accident. It was manipulated prior to the lantern's fall." No one spoke. Purbright continued, "We have also observed that a second lantern, similar in appearance, was positioned near the Fosdyke stall earlier in the morning. Its presence was unnoticed at the time, but it was removed before the display proceeded. This duplicate explains some of the discrepancies in witness recollections." Cribb blinked. Mrs. Fenton pursed her lips. Marian Fosdyke's gaze remained steady, but the tightening of her fingers on her lap betrayed an internal struggle. Purbright shifted slightly to consider the timetable. Lastly, the soot-stained railway schedule returned to Mrs. Fosdyke's shed last evening. Placed carefully, deliberately, it was not theft nor simple mischief. Its placement indicates knowledge, awareness of the widow's routines, and intent to provoke observation without confrontation. He let the statement linger. "We now understand that these acts, the movement of the lantern, the duplicate display, the return of the timetable, are connected not by chaos, but by deliberate design." Blunn's brow furrowed. "So, someone wanted to frighten her?" "Not frighten," Purbright said gently, "but remind that actions leave traces and that even the smallest gestures, bent hooks, misplaced objects, are observed by those who understand subtleties of presence and propriety." Marian's lips parted. "Then it was not random. It was someone who knew what they were doing." "Precisely," Purbright said. "And the person responsible understood Flaxborough's peculiar combination of vigilance and discretion. That is why the manipulations were subtle, why witnesses recalled differing details, and why the town's gossip has carried varied stories without settling on a single version of events." He allowed a brief pause, observing the group. "The initial assumption that Mr. Blunn might have interfered has been tested against evidence, alibis, and observation. His presence at the hall and his corroboration by a reliable witness demonstrate he was not the manipulator. Councillor Pook's conjecture, though enthusiastic, relied on convenience rather than fact." Blunn relaxed slightly, though he did not smile. Marian inclined her head, still cautious but reassured. Mrs. Fenton's sharp gaze suggested satisfaction at having her own observations validated. Purbright then returned his attention to the widow. "Mrs. Fosdyke, the acts targeted your understanding of propriety and vigilance. The manipulator relied on the town's habit of observing appearances, counting on the natural reticence of individuals to admit more than they wished. Your reactions, composed yet attentive, were precisely what allowed the orchestrator's intent to remain partially obscured." Marian blinked slowly. "Then you know who it is?" Purbright's eyes met hers with quiet civility. "We understand the methods, the motives, and the sequence. All that remains is acknowledgement of the actor's subtle manipulations." He allowed the room to absorb the implication, noting the small, involuntary adjustments of posture, the micro-expressions of realization. These were the moments that revealed truth, not dramatic declarations, but slight, cumulative acknowledgments of prior knowledge and observation. "Each of you," he continued, "has contributed to clarifying events by your own observations, attentiveness, and in some cases discretion. By assembling this account in calm reflection, we can see the sequence clearly. The lantern's fall, the duplicate, the returned timetable. Each deliberate, each designed to be observed yet remain subtle. The person responsible acted within the bounds of propriety, exploiting the town's attention to appearances." A faint hum of understanding settled over the group. The widow exhaled quietly, as though the invisible weight she had carried for days had begun to lift. Blunn straightened, no longer defensive, but alert, curious as to the precision of the observation. Mr. Cribb and Mrs. Fenton nodded subtly, acknowledging the clarity Purbright's methodical exposition had brought. Purbright concluded softly, "The town's natural habits of scrutiny and discretion allowed the manipulations to remain partially concealed, yet by careful observation, reflection on propriety, and attention to subtle gestures, the truth, calm, complete, and precise, emerges without need for alarm or dramatic confrontation." The group remained quiet, each processing the assembly of facts, the reconstruction of sequences, and the deliberate orchestration of events. In Flaxborough, where appearances mattered above all, the revelation had arrived not with a flourish but with subtlety, exactly as Purbright intended. The smallest details, long overlooked, had produced clarity. The threads of observation and social interaction had been woven into a coherent pattern, exposing the orchestrator's methods without disrupting the town's sense of civility. Finally, Purbright leaned back, hands folded. "I trust this clears the matter satisfactorily." Marian Fosdyke inclined her head, a faint relief passing across her features. "Yes, Inspector, thank you." Blunn made a small grunt of acknowledgement, and Mrs. Fenton allowed a slight smile to form. The tension that had quietly threaded through days of observation and speculation had eased, replaced by comprehension and a measure of order restored. Purbright rose, glancing around the room. "Then we may consider the events at last understood. The purpose of the manipulations, subtle, deliberate, and respectful of appearances, has been revealed through patient observation and reflection. The town may resume its routines, and yet the lessons of attention, propriety, and vigilance remain." The participants departed quietly, their expressions thoughtful but composed. Purbright remained, considering the room, the scattered remnants, and the invisible architecture of intent now laid bare. Flaxborough had witnessed another layer of human nature, subtle, restrained, and ultimately illuminating. He allowed himself a small smile. Calm, precise, and entirely civil, the truth had been assembled. The town and its people could now proceed, untroubled, but slightly wiser for the experience. Flaxborough returned, in its customary rhythm, to the gentle hum of small-town life. Shops opened, bell chimes announced midday, and the market square carried its usual mixture of curiosity and civility. To any casual observer, the events surrounding the Fosdyke lantern had been minor disruptions, a broken object, a few anxious glances, and the inevitable murmur of gossip that accompanies anything out of the ordinary. Yet for those who had been involved, and for Inspector Purbright, the calm was only the surface expression of a far more intricate sequence of observations, interventions, and human intentions. Widow Fosdyke emerged from her terrace at a measured pace, shawl neatly draped and eyes steady, though softened with relief. She paused at the corner to observe the small bustle of the street, then continued toward the post office, nodding politely to neighbours whose glances lingered on her more than usual. There was no outward sign of anxiety, though Purbright knew that in her quiet composure lay acknowledgment of events now clarified and understood. The careful orchestration of propriety, the interplay of observation and discretion, had been restored, leaving her, at last, free to navigate the town without the tension of uncertainty pressing on her. Mr. Cribb, meanwhile, returned to his birds, attending to the Wyandottes with a meticulous care that had always bordered on obsessive. He glanced at the hall occasionally, as if to reassure himself that the world had not shifted entirely in the wake of the minor upheaval. Yet beneath the preoccupation with feathers and cages there was a subtle sense of satisfaction that the strange sequence of events had not implicated him, and that his own vigilance had been indirectly validated. Flaxborough, he reflected, had demonstrated its capacity for both intrigue and restraint. Mrs. Fenton resumed her work, tidying flower displays and attending to clients at her hairdressing shop. She moved with her habitual precision, yet there was a small, unspoken acknowledgment that her observations, carefully noted and remembered, had contributed to understanding the sequence that had confounded the town for days. The quiet satisfaction of clarity, though imperceptible to outsiders, influenced her gestures, lending a measured confidence to routine actions. Even Edgar Blunn adjusted his habits, though reluctantly. The mistaken suspicion, corrected by alibi and observation, had been a lesson in perception and the consequences of outward appearances. He mended minor disputes with his neighbours, not out of newfound warmth, but because the practicalities of reputation and propriety dictated such an approach. Flaxborough's social fabric, delicate and easily disturbed, was restored to its accustomed tension and harmony in a single, unremarkable afternoon. Inspector Purbright returned to the station with the same quiet step he had used throughout the investigation. The small office, lined with papers and the remnants of his meticulous record-keeping, seemed to breathe more easily now that the sequences of events had been traced and the key participants understood. The bent hook, carefully preserved, rested in its envelope. The soot-stained timetable had been returned to the widow under her direction. The duplicate lantern had been accounted for. Each piece, previously a locus of speculation and uncertainty, now existed as a testament to the subtle orchestration that had guided the week's incidents. He seated himself at his desk and began the routine paperwork that followed any case, however minor. Reports were drafted, notes filed, and observations catalogued with the precision that had defined his approach. Yet even in this mundane occupation, Purbright reflected on the larger truths uncovered, the quiet power of observation, the influence of propriety, and the manner in which human intentions, when guided by knowledge of appearances, could produce outcomes as intricate as any overt action. There was a faint knock at the office door. Malley entered, carrying a bundle of completed forms. "All settled, sir," he said. "The widow's satisfied, Blunn's back to his usual routine, Cribb's birds are behaving, Mrs. Fenton seems content." Purbright nodded. "Yes, the town has resumed its natural rhythm, but let us remember that rhythm is shaped by perception as much as by action. Flaxborough has a delicate balance. Minor interventions can ripple through unnoticed, producing effects beyond the immediate incident." Malley blinked. "So, it's finished then?" "In a sense," Purbright said, allowing a faint smile. "The immediate sequence of events has concluded. Yet human nature and attention to propriety will continue to influence small actions, unnoticed but consequential. That is the quiet work of observation, understanding not merely what occurred, but why. He turned to the window, watching a mother guide her child along the cobbled street, and a shopkeeper arrange pastries with the habitual precision demanded by habit and reputation. Each movement, ordinary though it appeared, was informed by the same subtle social currents that had governed the incidents with the lantern. Flaxborough, ever self-regulating in its mixture of civility and curiosity, had returned to normalcy, yet the lessons of observation, discretion, and subtlety remained embedded in its routines. The inspector allowed himself a final glance at the small envelope containing the bent hook, noting its significance in the chain of events. A trivial object, yet revealing in its manipulation, it stood as a symbol of the case's deeper truth. Human behavior, when observed with patience and attention, could illuminate intention even when masked by propriety. And in Flaxborough, where the maintenance of appearances was both art and obligation, such revelations were achieved quietly, without spectacle, through the gentle accumulation of insight and the careful reading of small gestures. Purbright leaned back in his chair, hands folded across the desk, and exhaled. The office was calm, the day advancing toward evening, and the town, for all its whispers and speculations, had returned to its unremarkable but ordered existence. The widow's lantern had shattered, minor disturbances had occurred, and the subtle movements of people had been traced to their origin. The sequence of events, once opaque and confounding, had been assembled with clarity and civility. He rose, adjusted his hat, and looked toward the quiet streets of Flaxborough. The town would continue its routines, carrying forward the balance of observation and propriety that governed its small, intricate society. Individuals would act, react, and perceive, unaware that a case had been resolved, a lesson learned, and a truth revealed with patience, insight, and discretion. Returning to his desk for the final entries, Purbright felt the faint satisfaction that came from a case concluded not with drama, but with quiet order restored. The town's routines, undisturbed in appearance, yet subtly shifted by the events of recent days, had resumed their measured cadence. The widow would continue her displays, the neighbours their observations, and the subtle interplay of propriety and perception would persist, as it always did in Flaxborough. And for the inspector the work, though quietly completed, remained a testament to the enduring value of patience, attention, and careful reflection.